on the ground floor of his church, somewhere down there. There's a particularly well-known verger reading from the Bible. This verger was said to be like an Italian in that he perpetually tried to resist the course of nature. It actually meant the poor guy trimmed his fingernails and washed his hair, which was pretty rare. Anyway, as Charlemagne watched him reading the Bible, to his great fascination, a spider started to come down from the ceiling and landed straight on top of this verger's head. Now, the verger must have felt it as it landed, but he was so terrified of the emperor's eye, because Charlemagne was a big man, he didn't muck around with him. He was so terrified of the emperor's eye that he carried on reading the book. And the spider jumped onto his head, ran down his neck, bit him on the neck and killed him. Charlemagne was mortified. He hadn't actually been able to look after the welfare of one of his subjects, and he did penance in his own church for it. It's a good story. It embodies all of Charlemagne's principles: the watching, the education, and the idea of a just ruler. Actually, the man spent most of his life fighting all around the borders of his empire. But when he wasn't fighting foreigners, he was actually fighting for good order inside his own kingdom. He did it by a number of ways. He framed marvelous laws. Charlemagne's laws are the basis of civil law in Europe to this day, education system, anything you can think of. And he also did it too by setting up Bible writing schools inside the monasteries. There were practically no books in Europe. Charlemagne himself was illiterate, but he knew the power of writing and of that book. This beautiful style of writing, developed by Charlemagne's scribes, is not only the ancestor of all Western handwriting, but is also the medium through which the wisdom of the ancient world has come down to us. Most of the oldest surviving manuscripts of classical writing, Cicero, Virgil, and all the rest of them, are copies that were made in Charlemagne's monasteries. It was Charlemagne's Bibles, however, that had the most effect. The four evangelists became the heroes of his brave new world. Cassiodorus' Latin Bible became a standard imperial Bible text. The Bible, the written word of God, was covered in gold, made as precious as a jewel. After Charlemagne's death, though the emperors and courtiers were themselves mostly illiterate, they all thought it was a noble thing, a royal duty indeed, to support scholar monks and pay for them to make fine books. So learning was revived, and Cassiodorus' perfect Latin text came to hold the pith of European wisdom. The Bible had come to stand at the heart of the new Christian civilization that was slowly growing in Northern Europe. One of the most beautiful and one of the most moving examples of this enduring of the Word of God, this making a new prestige object out of the Bible, is a pulpit made by one of Charlemagne's successors for the court chapel at Aachen. And this is it. Down the sides are actually antique ivories from Egypt. It's a bit like the history of the Bible, really. These are much older than Charlemagne, these columns of ivories. They actually got Greek gods and things like that on. The goddess of Alexandria, Isis, who became the Blessed Virgin Mary. Got Dionysius, the god of drinks, swaying around with his grapes and everything. But it's the cross in the middle that really holds your eye, isn't it? It's a magnificent thing. In each of its corners, it's got one of the four evangelists: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, busily writing their Gospels. The cross itself is a really bizarre collection of objects. There's ancient chess pieces there, but the big blobby bits, the ones that look like fruit gums, are actually bits of Roman crockery, turned up the other way and bunged into the gold. Right in the middle of that nice blue fruit bowl down there, there used to be, stuck on, one of the finest cameos in the world. It's an ancient Roman cameo, and it has a superb picture of an eagle on it. It was made in the time of the Roman emperors. Charlemagne and his successors adopted that ancient Roman sign just the same way they thought they put on the cloak of the Roman emperors. That became the Black Eagle of the German Empire. It's marvellous. They're sort of burning with the fire of northern faith now, you might say. These things that have been brought from the south, like the Bible, and stuck up here. And of course, even in the most ancient times when this was brand new, the lectern was always here. This is a new one, but there was an old one. We got fragments of it. And here, of course, would have stood one of the Carolingian Bibles, the real triumph of Charlemagne's court. They became the justification of nations, of capitalism too, the root of law, the seed perhaps of all the rising power of the West. And in the East, in those same centuries, old Christianity, the Christianity of Constantine and Justinian, was slowly dying. The great old city of Constantinople finally fell to the Turks on a Tuesday, the 29th of May, 1453. All that spring, the people on the walls had watched as the Turkish army dragged up its huge siege cannons. It didn't dare put any cannons on their walls. They were 1,000 years old, and they felt they'd just disintegrate. Early on that Tuesday morning, the Turkish cannon started lobbing these huge granite cannonballs against the walls. They knocked them down so much in a few places that the Turks were actually able to ride into the city. But actually, the city just fell apart. It was penetrated by the Turkish army in several different places. They were outnumbered 6, perhaps even 10 to 1. The Turks were banging on the door shortly after they killed the emperor. That was about an hour after sunrise. Look, what happened was this. The evening before, just before midnight, the last emperor of Byzantium had come into this church for the last time for communion. The great jeweled Bibles and the crosses had been carried to the altar, and all the Italian and the Greek knights who were going out with the emperor the next day prayed. And then they'd walked out of this church, bolted the doors. They left the whole court of Byzantium, all the senators, the scholars, and their wives and their children. When the Turks finally got into the church, they killed everybody who resisted, stripped the rest, put them in chains, and they were led off into slavery. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, after he conquered Constantinople, came into the church on that first day on his horse. And legend says that when he came in here, he looked at the church and told his men to stop damaging it, which is what they were doing, and said, this is obviously a building meant for God. So it became the Mosque of the Divine Wisdom instead of the Church of the Divine Wisdom. And it's said that he put his hand in one of the pillars and spun it round to face Mecca. And 3 days later, of course, prayers were held in here and the Sultan's brow literally touched the marble floor. Do you know, at that time, it was said that you could buy 10 books for any coin that you might possess. Now, Byzantium was stuffed with books. There was all the learning of the Greek world in this town. The works of Homer, Aristotle, Plato, God knows what we do not know was here. It was all destroyed in that period. For the story of the Bible, it's probably its most tragic time. How much of the Bible's history was lost then? Obviously, all the great Bibles of Byzantium with their golden covers were just stripped and thrown down. But think of the ancient manuscripts that were here. Manuscripts that went back, who knows, practically the time of Jesus. Nobody knows. Half the history of the Bible was lost on that day. On that day, too, Christianity lost its last direct connection with the real ancient Bible world. Under Turkish rule, Greek, the very language of the New Testament, became a provincial language. Since then, of course, the entire Christian world has been even further isolated from its own beginnings. This mostly by things of its own making, by social and industrial revolutions and 2 huge wars. Yet that seed that Charlemagne planted in the middle of Europe has remained through the centuries. It's only lost its real power, indeed, in the last 100 years or so. I suppose it was his monasteries, those great monasteries that Charlemagne set up, that really started Europe on the boil again. They really generated a new economy in Europe. Even the weather got better, everything got better. Water power was developed, they started breeding animals, the population went up, bingo, you were into a new world, it was wonderful. But it was still a world based on the Bible. You see, that Gothic period, which came along after Charlemagne and really didn't conk out until 15th, 16th century, hundreds and hundreds of years later, that period still held the Bible at its centre. Because throughout all that time, even with the new technology, the people in that society weren't that far from Bible people. When they read their Bible and it said there were shepherds abiding in the fields, or there was a guy who was a tanner, or a this or a that, they knew about that. They still had those people. They still had courts and chamberlains and all the rest, just like Herod the Great. It wasn't that different. And that Bible supplied everybody in that society in Europe for hundreds of years with an identity, with a dignity. Everybody from a thief to a king had his place in the Bible. And those great churches that they built, filled up with statues, they're all to do with placing everybody in that society in terms of their Bible characters and their Bible equivalents and the morality of it all stuck together. And you could say then that the Gothic world is the most successful Bible culture of the West. They thought it was literally a mirror image of the world in the Bible itself.